Good morning, everybody. I'm very excited today to be hosting Marlene Laruelle and Vuk Vuksanovic for a discussion of Russia's soft power, which I think is a topic that generates a fair amount of debate and a topic of particular interest of mine. So let me, with no further ado, introduce Marlene and then Vuk. So Marlene Laruelle is Director and Research Professor at the Institute for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. At IERES, I always worry how you say these acronyms. She is also director of the Illiberalism Studies program, a co-director of FONAR's program on new approaches to research and security in Eurasia, which I'm sure you'll read as avidly as I do, and the founder and director of the Central Asia program. Dr. Laruelle received her PhD in history at the National Institute of Oriental Languages and Cultures and her postdoctoral degree in political science at Sciences Po in Paris. She's published widely on Russia's ideologies and nationalism, on Russia's foreign policy and soft power strategies, and has published 10 monographs, the last one being Is Russia Fascist? With Cornell University Press. So quite the list of achievements. And Vuk Vuksanovic, she's joined today by Vuk Vuksanovic. She's a senior researcher at the Belgrade Centre for Security Policy and an associate at LSE IDEAS, a foreign policy think tank within the London School of Economics and Political Science. His PhD in international relations from the LSE in international relations had dealt with the Serbian balancing act between Russia and the West. Before that, he worked at the Serbian Foreign Ministry and as a political risk consultant. His primary field of research is great power politics, with a particular emphasis on the Balkans. Marlene and Vuk, thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course, my pleasure. Jay, do you want me to begin?
Yes, please.
Yeah, good to see all of you. Nice to meet the next generation of specialists of the region. Let me begin by just giving you very short kind of key takeaways of my vision of Russia's soft power, and then Vuk will continue with a specific focus on the Balkan region. So my first point would be that, for me at least, the usual definition of soft power that we all know by Joseph Nye, it's pretty biased because it had the US as this kind of benchmark, like explicitly said or implicitly, right? So it's always this idea that to have soft power, you need to have a universalistic project, and you more or less need to promote one way or another democracy and liberalism. And I think that is pretty wrong. And that there are other ways of being influential, and that Russia is showing that it had or still has, that's another question, some soft power. And so the way I've been trying to frame it is that I called it niche soft power. So a soft power that is overtly and assumed to be a particularistic soft power, not a universalistic one, but a particularistic one that is speaking to different audiences. And I think that was very clear on the Russian side, and we can discuss after who is the Russian side, that there is no way they can compete with the US in terms of soft power. They don't have the ideology, they don't have the infrastructure to produce the soft power that the US is producing, or some European countries. So their strategy has been to speaking to different audiences with different narratives. So each time the narratives can be adapted to the audience, and it's really a techniques coming from micro-targeting, from the political advertisement as we know it in the US, and that's something that Russia has been applying to its soft power. So what they have been able to do is to build ideological connection, communication connection with different audiences in different regions of the world, and all put together. It's not so much, but it's enough to disrupt the kind of general consensus. And that's enough, I think, for Russia to consider that it still has its voice heard, and it can still, just being the disruptor of the system is already an achievement. So when we try to look at the different type of soft power that Russia has been applying, I see several of them in terms of their kind of ideological content. You have what I call the self-referential narrative. So where it's Russia talking about itself, about its history, its victories, like space conquest, Second World War. So it's a narrative that speaks to very small audiences that are already connected to Russia, like diaspora or Russian-speaking population. They have a soft power that is playing the religious card. And that's what is interesting with Russia, is that you have the Christian and the Islamic card that are played at the same time. Russia can present itself as the savior of Christian values to some Christian groups, and it can present itself as a good positive actor of Islam on the international scene when it's speaking to some Islamic group or to the Middle Eastern countries. And you have this kind of religious paradiplomacy functioning in parallel, the Christian and the Islamic. And they even interact with each other pretty closely. We have seen it in Syria, for example, or in the Middle East globally. Then you have, of course, what has been probably the most discussed, which is the Russian soft power toward the conservative European constituencies and the American one around Christian values, traditional families, cultural sovereignty, fear of immigration. But you also have something that has been less studied, that Russian soft power toward the left, the European left, but also the Latin American left, and all the kind of post-colonial world in Africa and so on. And so that's really interesting when you look at the Russian narrative for Latin America or Africa. It's very much a Soviet legacy narrative. Russia as the heir of the Soviet Union fighting against Western and especially US imperialism with a lot of leftist narrative. So you see different niches that are each time they are contradictory with each other, but that's not a problem. That's maybe a problem for us as experts, but that's not a problem seen from the Russian side, because contradiction is considered as a normal process on the Russian side. So that was my first point. The second point is to look at how Russia has been instrumental in that. And I think it took them some years to realize they could potentially play with that soft power. And then gradually it became kind of officialized in several institutions of Russia's public diplomacy. Then it got mentioned in some official documents, like some concept and national strategies. And then it has been really used at its maximum, I would say, after Putin's third term, so 2012, until probably the war now. So you had very active public diplomacy, of course, state media, what I call entrepreneur of influence. So those people who are somewhere in the gray area of the regime, they are not part of any official institution, but they still have the approval of the Kremlin to act as intermediary or power broker to build that soft power. And what is interesting for me in this niche of ideological entrepreneur of influence is that it's really a neoliberal system, that people need to make money on their own soft power mechanism because the Russian state is not paying for them. So they really take risk, ideological risk and kind of financial risk in trying to promote Russia's interest. If it works, they can be rewarded by the Kremlin. If they fail, like there were several moments where Prigozhin, for example, failed in Africa, then he failed and he's on his own money. And then you have, of course, a lot of underground operations. So what is interesting on the Russian side is that it has been a pretty decentralized process with many actors, and still you have a broad coordination in terms of theme and topics that all these actors are playing with. Third point, and I will go very fast now, not to take too much time. I think one of the big issues on the way the West has been analyzing Russia's soft power has been the use of the notion of influence. This notion of influence is academically problematic because it implicitly forces us to think that it's a top-down process coming from Russia toward the different audiences. And I think if you look at the literature on this Russian influence in Europe and all over the world, it's mostly looking at the Russian side much more than at the local side. And when it's look at the local side, it's always tend to see local actor as kind of puppet of Russia. And I think that has been a big mistake in our analysis, because local actors have their own agency. And very often they are the ones who have been initiating the relationship with Russia, because it's good for their own agenda to use Russia as a brand, right? And so, for example, the French National Front in France, they have been the one initiating contact with Russia even before Russia initiated contact with them, just because Russia and Putin is a brand, or was a brand for this kind of European far right. So I think there are more and more literature that really try to show the local perspective, and the agency of these local actors. And so it's evolving. And then last points, and then I give the floor to Vuk, that what happened after February 24, where I think the Russian soft power has been largely destroyed, at least in Europe. Not totally destroyed. I think there are still pretty good number of people among those who are already kind of pro-Russian who are continuing admiring Russia and Putin, but of course they cannot say it in the open way they were able to say it before. But that doesn't mean it has disappeared. It just become more silent, but it may reappear. Of course, it will depend on how the war evolves and who is received as or perceived as a winner. And then I don't think it has been so much destroyed in the global south. Or if something has been destroyed in the global south, it's Russia's military soft power, if I may say that. Russia failure at succeeding militarily has been pretty received with kind of anxiety by a lot of global south countries, for whom the Russian military were the kind of something that you were admiring. So I think Russia lost part of its soft power for reasons that are the contrary of the one in the West. But I think it still has a lot of part of its soft power in the global south, and that's something that the Western experts have still difficulties catching, because the war is not read the same way in Latin America or in Africa or in Asia as it in Europe. And I think I would just stop here and looking forward very much to the discussion, and I'm letting Vuk continuing.
Thank you so much. There's so many interesting points for us to pick up on there. Vuk, if you'd like to give your opening remarks now.
Thanks a lot, Jade. Well, I mean, I will talk about these soft power elements as it applies to the Balkans, but also as it applies to Serbia. I mean, the central country in the region, and of course, a partnership between Russia and Serbia has been largely been a bedrock of Russia's policies in the region, for that matter. Now, of course, I would just briefly start, with the same issue that Marlene touched upon, which is the issue: what is soft power? Of course, we all know that when Joseph Nye introduced the concept, he always said that actually soft power is something that radiates from the society itself. So, it is your ability to attract some attention and respect through the appeal of your socioeconomic model, your political institutions, or your popular culture. So, it doesn't necessarily depend on state policies. Nye, in his numerous works where he has constantly revised and reflected on his concept, constantly said that you even had occasions where, of course, America was disliked for its foreign policy, as in case of the Vietnam era, but its popular culture was and soft power was pretty much there, because the popular culture in Vietnam, of course, produced the hippie era and the anti-Vietnam movies during this period. However, this is now we have a fact that a whole set of players believe, actually, and this includes not just Russia and China, but paradoxically, even the Western powers have instinctively adopted this idea that you can actually do through state policy, that you can actually improve your soft power through deliberate state policies. And for players like Russia and China, they actually do believe, yes, just like you can order your institutions to work on modernizing the military, you can order your institutions to try to boost your country's soft power appeal globally. Even 2013 Russian foreign policy strategy underlines the need for Russia to boost its soft power credentials. During this period, Xi Jinping also said something about the need of China to boost its own soft power credentials. And now, of course, this brings us to the Balkans, because in the Balkans and in Serbia, Russia has three pillars of influence, three sources of influence. Number one is the unresolved Kosovo dispute, which always puts Serbia in a state of political dependency vis-a-vis Moscow because it needs Russian backing in the UN Security Council because of Moscow's veto. Number two, energy dependence. And number three is soft power. Soft power interpreted as Russian popularity among large swaths of the population. Now, Russian state does some things. I mean, yes, of course, Russian embassy in Belgrade does some things. You have cultural events. You have the so-called Russian home, which was opened up in Belgrade in the 1930s by white emigres, which is now heavily linked with the Russian government. But none of these is the game changer. Of course, you also have powerful ties with the Orthodox Church. I mean, we had a very powerful image in 2019 when Saint Sava Temple, a big Orthodox temple in Belgrade, which was basically refurbished in part with the Russian donations. Vladimir Putin came and a big crowd greeted him. But not even ties with the Serbian Orthodox Church paint a full picture. So why is Russia popular in the Balkans and in Serbia in particular? I will focus on Serbia always in particular, not for what Russia is, but for what it is not. Russia is popular in Serbia because it is not the West. Because in Serbia, while the frequently narrative is the talk about pan-Slavic and pan-Orthodox ties, actually the knowledge of average citizens on Russian culture, on Russian institutions, on everyday realities in Russia is extremely limited. And even many pro-Russia and many agents of the Russian governments also acknowledge that when they talk about their country's ties with Serbia. So why is Russia popular? Number one, because of the memories of the 1990s and because of the Serbian frustration with the Kosovo's independence of 2008. So in a sense, this famous Serbian balancing act between Russia and the West has its foundation in the domestic popularity of Russia. Because the Serbian policymakers of different kinds, they see on one hand a society which, if you tour Belgrade, you can instinctively see a very consumerist, pretty much Western society, no different than any European cities, but which also sometimes tends to show strong sympathies towards the Russian cause. So you have a emotionally divided electorate. So for many politicians, balancing between Russia and the West is also part of the electoral strategy, hoping to catch the votes of both pro-Russian and pro-Western voters at the same time. And of course, you can also score some domestic mileage by capitalizing on Russia's popularity. I mean, basically, the mentioned 2019 gathering where Putin was greeted by hundreds of thousands of people in Saint Sava Temple in January 2019. That was basically done not just to show to the Russophilic parts of the electorate that the Serbian president is the one who is cherishing friendship with Russia, but it was also done at the moment when Serbian leadership was faced with very tough anti-government protests. So he was showing the opposition, I can also gather, just like you, a large gathering on the streets. So by nourishing partnership with Russia and capitalizing on its popularity in the Serbian public opinion, you can score a lot of domestic mileages. Now, what are the narratives? What are the themes that is being talked about when we talk about Serbo-Russian ties? Something that can be qualified under the story of soft power or the narratives. I mean, it can be quite diverse. Putin can be a leader who fights American hegemony, who fights the decadent West, a defender of the Orthodoxy, a defender of the Slavs, and this is this is very different compared to the old Soviet Union, which only had a lure among leftists and communist groups. I mean, present-day Russia can be appealing to both left and right. To the left, because it is being perceived as an heir to the Soviet Union, which challenges the neoliberal capitalism, while for the right, it can be perceived as the defender of the traditional values. And of course, this is very important, and this is a large part of how Russia operates in the region, because I have already told you that this domestic sensitivity to the popularity of Russia. But this way, Russia can actually build a very powerful emotional appeal with certain social and political groups within a given society. And that way, by extension, it can also build a bargaining power with the local government as an extension of this type of practice. But there are a couple of caveats, because for all the talks, and this was particularly popular after 2016 and the stories of Trump's election and Russiagate in the US, but despite all the talks, it was actually local agency, local players who were more deserving of spreading pro-Russian narrative rather than some heavy organized Russian campaigns. I mean, in 2015, so around 2015, Radio Sputnik was already operating in the Balkans, while, for example, despite the idea to open up a Serbian bureau of Russia Today, which would cover the Western Balkans, they gave up on the idea because they didn't think that the Western Balkan market is that much important, despite the fact that some other news outlets like CNN and Al Jazeera and even BBC has its Serbian portal operating in the region. So back then, the Russians didn't perceive it. Who was spreading the pro-Russian narratives? It was the pro-government tabloids. And this is particularly important in Serbia. Number one, why was this done? Number one, so that the local players can capitalize on the popularity of Russia. I mean, we had a very famous statement by a director of the largest pro-government tabloid in Serbia, who basically said, I'm a businessman. If I put on a calendar with Putin's picture where he's bare-chested, I will sell several 100,000 print copies. And if I put Catherine Ashton, I won't even sell 50 copies. So that's the way how local players want to capitalize. And number two, because this was a very good way to leverage and blackmail the West. Because Serbian leader Aleksandar Vučić could that way send a projection to the West saying, I'm surrounded with pro-Russian agents everywhere, so you need to prop me up if you don't want to see me overthrown by pro-Russian players. And that means sometimes tolerating some things that you don't tolerate to other countries, like, for example, a severe rule of law decline. But now I have to say that this has become a major source of impediment for the Serbian government, because now Putin has become a rock star. So you cannot join any policies which are being perceived as anti-Russian, because you will lose that exact pro-Russian public, which you have done a great deal of feeding over the past 8 years. And a very strong case in point, and you probably, some of you may have seen this image because it was noticed by international media, was in March, when we had a big gathering, pro-Russian gathering in Belgrade, which is one of the rare gatherings of this kind, probably the only one that you can find in Europe at this point in time. But even at this point in time, we do have some changes. I mean, Russia Today is announcing that it is going to open up its office in Serbia, and several other Western companies like Yandex also appear to come. So that also speaks to you that now Serbia's price is up for the Russian soft power machinery, because now when you're being banned everywhere in Europe, Serbia might be this small gap, this small platform from which you can project a Russian narrative and from which you can show a Russian perspective. But of course, we have also seen that Russian influence is limited even more now. And some of you are aware of the episode where Sergei Lavrov wanted to visit Belgrade, but he couldn't do it because EU's airspace was close to Russian airliners. So that tells you something, that in this context, with this state of Russia-West relations, the Serbo-Russian partnership will be downgraded and impeded as a result. But nevertheless, a soft power allure of Russia will probably still remain the most impressive element of Russia's influence in both the Serbia and the rest of the Western Balkans. And on that point, I will end. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Vuk. I think my first question really relates to, I suppose, the idea of the West and its ideas. So, for example, is the fact that so much of Russian soft power is actually, a lot of it is kind of anti-Western? How does that influence the fact that Westerners don't, or Western leaders don't always take Russian soft power seriously?
Yeah, I think that's a key question. And I think we don't ask it to ourselves enough. And my vision is that, for example, the current discussion we have about the global south doesn't want to join the sanctions. They need to understand that Russia is an empire and has a colonial policy toward Ukraine. For me, my reading is that we don't put ourselves, the West, into the picture enough to realize that a large part of the Russian legitimacy in terms of producing narrative is indeed based on criticizing the West we can then discuss if we consider the West making some mistakes, but they have some strong points about the US not respecting international law. They have strong points about the West kind of normative imperialism and the fact that the international institutions are not really representing the global order as it is on the ground and so on. And for me, I think that's key element that resonate very easily with people who wouldn't present themselves as a Russophile or, defending Russia's position. It's just that in the global south, it speaks to a lot of people to consider that the West is, or the US, largely a problem, if not the main problem or a key problem of the international order now. I mean, if you're in Latin America, I think that would be obvious by the tradition of Latin America. And that's a narrative that can speak both to the left and to the right of the audiences, depending on the cultural context. So for me, it's always key. But of course, you will find a lot of Western experts who would say that if you say that, you are kind of playing the Russian card of putting the two things at the same level, and you cannot compare, US invasion of Iraq and the recognition of Kosovo, which was Russia in doing. Yeah, of course. But still, I consider that the West has been doing mistake that has then been used by Russia. So because you see the point in when you create soft power, people don't have to buy the whole spectrum of what you are saying. You just have to find some resonance points that people are sharing, right? And so if you always share that, well, I don't understand why US has been, invading Iraq and why we did recognize Kosovo. You don't need to believe that Putin is a great guy, but then if suddenly you are listening to Russia Today and you feel things that are resonating with your own view, then suddenly that can create the connection, and that connection can develop into a broader support for Russia, or it can stay just there. But that's enough for Russia to create mini niches of legitimacy just by stating loudly things that some people are thinking and don't necessarily find voices telling them that. And I think that has been one of the big points of, Russia Today, when at the big time of their expansion of RT, to be stating that kind of narratives.
Thank you.
I think Vuk could add a lot on that, because I think for Serbia, it's very much like the pro-Russia is very much a critique of the West, right? A memory also.
Vuk, I would be really interested to hear your thoughts on that. And also, if there's any difference there with how maybe Chinese soft power, which is there's obviously some elements of competition, if you could feed in maybe that consideration as well. Thank you.
Well, of course, this pretty much fits into the same logic. For example, Serbia voted in the UN General Assembly on resolutions, for example, condemning Russian invasion and supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity. Of course, Serbia says that because of its own claim on the Kosovo dispute, it has to abide by the principle of territorial integrity without any compromise. And because of the pro-Russian popularity, the pro-government media were very shy about reporting on this resolution. But still, the government did not, despite this, the government did not suffer that much damage as a result of this vote. And this is pretty much the storyline, because, yes, saying we respect Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, it is fine. But the moment if you say we will join sanctions, most people remember the 1990s sanctions which was imposed by the UN because of the Bosnian War. They remember how it destroyed society and how it destroyed even the pockets of the society which were against the Milosevic's regime. And so when they hear, for example, those those phrases like rules-based order, people go nuts. Because they see, the first thing that they see when they hear those words are 1999, Then they hear a U.S. invasion of Iraq, invasion of Libya. So there is, of course, pretty much the same emotional state. But that also tells you something about Russia. Russian soft power is not that much about whether or not anyone actually knows the Russian language, or whether anyone has even met Russian citizens. It is about that Russia is being perceived as someone who is powerful enough to say no to the West. I mean, if China was probably geographically closer to Serbia, Xi Jinping would probably have this type of status that Vladimir Putin now enjoys. At the same time, when it comes to the way China operates, I would say that the story is somewhat quite similar, in a sense that, yes, we do see something from the Chinese. We had some Chinese documentary on national broadcaster. We do have some public diplomacy. I mean, the cultural center that the Chinese are about to build, which will be at the site of the former Chinese embassy, which was torn down by U.S. Air Force in 1999, will probably be one of their biggest cultural centers, probably in Europe, potentially even wider. And there is even some media content, but this is not where the appeal comes from. It is also the result of the local media and the local elites who want to force the pro-Chinese narrative so that they can leverage and blackmail the West. That has also been part of the same rubric and the same patterns of behavior. We have, of course, seen this during, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of you might remember a very famous speech, which was also received by many of the Western media, about the Serbian president accusing Europe of not doing enough to help, saying that European solidarity does not exist and that it is a fairy tale on paper, while China is the only country that can help, reading the Chinese sites in Belgrade being lit in the red colors of the Chinese flag, Serbian president even kissing the Chinese flag. And during this period, we also have the fact that Russian aid during COVID-19 did not receive the same VIP treatment as the Chinese one. And that was, of course, number one, that was also a sign that China has replaced Russia as Serbia's primary partner outside the Western world. And I expect that this will continue to be the case. But it is also the fact that during this period, Serbia tried to pivot towards the US under Donald Trump, and Russia was even at that point becoming something of a nuisance. So there is sort of an idea how you can switch and change the narratives when it suits you.
Thank you. And then one final question from me before we go to the fellows Q&A would be, again, to both of you, maybe slightly more to Marlene, but I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts too, Vuk, which is on how Russia's war on Ukraine is going to impact its soft power, and in particular, maybe some of its more traditional sense of soft power in the former Soviet Union and in Central Asia.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for the post-Soviet region, of course, the war is changing a lot because it shows Russia being unable to be successful enough in its soft power to keep Ukraine in its world, and having to go to a really the worst war possible. I think at least for Central Asia, it's changing a lot in the vision. For very long in Central Asia, the vision was that, Russia was reborn. It's a strong country. It's not perfect, but if you are a migrant from Central Asia, going to Moscow is the maximum of the West and of Western culture and of technology that you can get. And it's a big success in your life. And I think that will be, of course, now largely tainted by the war itself. But I think it will very much depend on how the war is evolving and who is winning or seen as the winner, because you still have a very large perception. And you see, the post-Soviet region doesn't exist anymore as a kind of ideological bloc, right? But seen from Central Asia, people are still very much pro-Russian in terms of foreign policy, right? Not in domestic politics, but in foreign policy. The general view seen from Central Asia is that the poor Ukrainians are just victims of the US, who just want to bother Russia, and Russia is reacting, maybe not well, but still is reacting to defend its own sovereignty, and it's okay. It's just too sad it's going as bad. So that would be the general narrative. So if Russia can win the war on whatever winning means, I think they can still keep part of their soft power. If they are losing the war, here also depending what it means losing, then of course it will change a lot. But I don't think Ukraine will be seen as a winner for Central Asia, and except for the small liberal minorities who are very much kind of feeling in touch with what is happening in Ukraine. Of course, in the Caucasus would be totally different. But the fact that Russian economy will be largely stagnating, if not worse, means also that it will be less attractive. The cultural soft power of Russia will probably be diminished also, because all the great cultural production that Russia was able to do, and I think it's always something interesting to mention, is that it was getting more and more repressive, but culturally Russia was producing a lot still until February 24, and maybe it will find a way to continue. I mean, it's now getting really more repressive, but there was this kind of blossoming moment of Russian culture even until very recently, and that had a lot of impact on the post-Soviet space, at least the culture that are still kind of open to what is happening in Russia. That all that will be probably largely destroyed. But as I said, even I don't think you see, it's not an equal balance. Russia's soft power will be diminished. I don't think the Western soft power will increase. I don't think the West will be seen as the good guy on the other side of the story. And I don't think there will be any kind of Ukrainian soft power, except maybe in Georgia and in some, but not in Central Asia, except for the small nationalist or liberal minorities, the elite level, right?
I presume that I'm next. So I mean, in Serbia, there are perhaps some nuances. Some might blame Russia, the others might feel genuinely sorry over the fact that the two Slavic nations are waging a war. Some might feel genuinely sorry for Ukraine, but perceive that it is being manipulated by the West into a conflict with Russia. But all of these are sidelines, because still, for the large swaths of the population, regardless of what they emotionally think about the war, frequently this war is being perceived as a revenge against American unipolarity, against against the Western hegemony, and revenge for all the past Western sins. So this is a very powerful theme, perhaps not among all the Serbs, but it is a very powerful theme on that point nevertheless. And I will tell you one thing. I had a couple of months ago a talk with a friend of mine who is a pro-Western, but a very balanced, not enthusiastically pro-Western, but still a pro-Western individual. And one of his fears was, if Russia is triumphant in this, there will be such a strong perception in this country that Russia is the force of the future. And that it doesn't pay off to be against the Russia, that it doesn't pay off to work to try to do anything with the European Union, that it doesn't pay off to have an anti-Western, anti-Russian policies. That has been one of the potential prospects. But given that your question was also, far away from my shores regarding Russian soft power in the places like Caucasus and Central Asia, I think that, yes, there is a certain sense of uneasiness about what the Russians did. Of course, it always does. They always believe, well, many of us still have a border with Russia. So, will Russia stomp on us if it ever perceives that its interests in our countries are endangered? But I still think that there is, of course, there is a discomfort there. But I also think that there is a very strong idea of pragmatism amongst the locals, that Russia is there, that it will always be there, and that as a result, the best thing that they can do is perhaps hedge their bets by buying themselves some breathing space by engaging with the likes of Turkey, as in case of the Caucasus country, or the likes of China in case of Central Asian countries.
Thank you very much for those answers.